Добар ден, драги колеги, драги студенти. Денес продолжуваме со серијата на гостински предавања кои вас треба да ви овозможат различни перспективи на секојдневни прашања. И она што теоретски го учиме во настава по различни предмети, да добиеме едно практично видување кое може подоцна да го имплементирате во работната пракса. Денешната тема е поттикната од 24 февруари, поттикната кога едно утро целата светска и европска јавност се разбуди во неверување во една нова геополитичка реалност која секако има длабоки импликации на политичкиот, економскиот живот, но секако и на човештвото, токму на оваа тема, на импликациите кои руската инвазија, агресија или интервенција повеќе, ако сакате, го има врз нашиот регион, особено, не само врз целиот свет, туку и врз нашиот регион и такви и слични односи. Наш денешен гостин е предавач, ќе биде доктор Долан. Тој е професор и директор на магистерската програма за разузнавање и безбедносни студии на коледжот Лебанон Вели во Пенсилванија. Доктор Долан е инаку член на одборот на Советот за светски прашања и на Сдруженијето за надворешна политика и проектот за транзиција на Белата куќа. Негов истражувачки фокус на интерес е американската национална безбедност, разузнавачка анализа, хибридната војна, сајбер безбедноста, дезинформација и операции на влијание. Пред да му дадам збор на гостинот кој ќе се обрати, обраќањето иначе ќе биде на тема што значи руската инвазија на Украина за земите од Западен Балкан и како што вика нашиот предавач не е толку лошо како што мислите, ние со задоволство ќе слушнеме дали е тоа така или не е така. И се надевам дека неговото предавање ќе предизвика интерес кај вас и ќе поставувате прашања и ќе дискутирате, ќе дебатирате на темата за да добиеме сите некаков вид на сознание. Пред да му дадам збор, само ќе го поканам координаторот на програмата за размена на амбасадата на Америка да ве поздрави, да ви се обрати. Повелете, господин Газмен Тилјази.
Благодарам. Благодарам за вашето присуство денеска. Нашето присуство е благодарејќи на нашата прекрасна соработка со председателот на вашиот универзитет, со основачот на вашиот универзитет. Мои најдобри релации се со господинот Сефер Цановски и по негова покана денеска го имате професор Долан тука за вас да ви се обрати на темата која што беше исто така избрана од вашите колеги ценети професори или менеджментот на универзитетот. Уште еднаш благодарам за вашето присуство, бидејќи, како што рече ректорката, јас ги водам разменските програми. Во моментов имаме 2-3 повици за последипломски или последокторски студии во Соединените американски држави. Така што сите вие што не следите денеска тука или преку онлайн мрежата, значи разгледајте ги овие можности и аплицирајте, бидејќи ќе имате истата можност да соработувате со некој од професорите како што е денеска тука, но во Соединените американски држави. Уште еднаш благодарам за вашето внимание, се надевам дека ќе уживате во презентацијата и очекуваме многу прашања од вас. Уште еднаш благодарам.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's nice that it's a sunny day. So thank you for the warm welcome. I really appreciate being here at this really impressive university at my college in the United States, Lebanon Valley College. It's very old. My college was begun. The construction was begun in 1865. At the end of the American Civil War, and it started off as a Civil War hospital. So it's very beautiful, beautiful brick buildings, a lot of space, but it's also very old. So it's nice being in a kind of ultra super modern building. So I just wanted to thank the faculty at the university, FON, and the U.S. Embassy here in Skopje, as well as the Fulbright Scholar Program, and my hosts at my host university at Southeast European University, and at the institute that I am doing my research at, the Max van der Stoel Institute. So since I've been in country since January, so I've been here almost 4 months, and this is my second Fulbright in the Balkans. My first was in Pristina in Kosovo several years ago, and then COVID interrupted it and I had to go home. Now I'm back. So my primary areas of interest are national security, but in particular cybersecurity, disinformation, as was said in the introduction, but also in the broader area of hybrid conflict. So the blending and blurring of different conventional and unconventional, political, non-political, or what we call kinetic or military and non-military domains. And so how conflict has changed over the years due in large part to technology, but also hybrid conflict is nothing new. And I've seen hybrid conflict elements as part of my theme that I'm going to be covering today on the role of the United States in the Western Balkans in the immediate wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, and I've learned a lot just being here. I've done research on political extremism in the Western Balkans. I've also done research on disinformation, the use of disinformation and proxy and intermediary groups all throughout the region. And I'm finishing up a book now in the United States, NATO, and the title of the book is going to be The United States, NATO, and Cold War 2.0. So, and I need to update the book to include all the information that I'm going to be basically presenting here today. And I'm going to be very critical of both the current Biden administration and very critical of the former Trump administration. So I think there's a lot of criticism that can go around, but I also think the game has changed as well. So I think that while the Russian invasion of Ukraine is incredibly tragic, I do think that there are some positive elements that are going to come out of this. And in reshaping, when I mean positive elements, I mean positive impact on U.S. foreign policy towards the region. So the theme of my talk today is the role of the United States in the Western Balkans in the immediate wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what research is showing, and everything that I'm going to be presenting here today is based on my research, nothing informed from any political party or political ideology. So I do my best. I'm not completely objective, but I kind of strive towards objectivity, trying to make data-informed decisions that are testing theories and ideas about the world. So as this war is dragging on, and I mean the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think that there's an uneasiness that's settling into the region in the Western Balkans. The images out of Ukraine are they've revived memories of the horrors that happened during the region on all sides in the 1990s, in particular in Kosovo and Bosnia, but also the people in this country, in North Macedonia. You should sleep better knowing that you are in NATO. Being a NATO member country is a good thing. And I'm not going to be talking, I'm not going to go into the detail. I'm not going to give a historical lesson here today. I'm not going to revisit the Prespa agreement, but I think being in NATO is a lot better for your security as a security provider and as a security consumer. So that means your country is tied to my country in a collective security alliance of 30 individual nation states who are committed to having each other's backs. And I think that is an important thing for this country. So the issue, though, the challenge is, at least this is how we look at the Western Balkans in the United States. The scholars who study the region refer to the Western Balkans as both an opportunity and a challenge. It's an enigma for America. It's very puzzling. And each time I'm here, I'm more and more confused about how to approach the region, who to talk to do my interviews, and so on and so forth. The Americans who study the region call the Western Balkans it's sort of like an enigma wrapped in a riddle, which is the old comment, description about a lot of Eastern Europe, but also Southeastern Europe, that the Western Balkans is it's a sort of a soft underbelly, and that is it's a region that's sort of still contested. It's caught between great power conflict, especially the United States and the EU on one side and Russia on the other. And I don't think the United States can stand idly by on the sidelines, which I think it has done for quite some time. I think that with the end of the Cold War, maybe after Operation Allied Force, the United States said, okay, we're done, everything's good in the region, we support EU integration, we support NATO integration, or NATO accession, yet we've got this other big rival in the world that we need to keep our eye on. And you know who I'm talking about, right? You know what country I'm talking about? China. So the United States adopted a very China-first U.S. foreign policy. And so I think after 9/11, the priority became, yes, the Middle East and the Persian Gulf and Al-Qaeda, but also America felt a sense of we're a unipolar power and we're going to do our best to make sure that there is no rival and challenger that could challenge the United States. And so after years of integrated trading relationships between the United States and China, what many scholars believe is the United States actually financed the rise of its future challenger, China, today. But I think that in a very problematic sense, the United States de-emphasized Europe under both the Bush administration and to a certain extent the Obama administration. And I think the United States is finally reprioritizing the region, as you can see by many visits by U.S. Diplomats in recent weeks. So the United States, I wouldn't argue, ignored the region, but I think the United States thought that EU integration would be the solver of everything, the sort of answer to all of the region's problems. And the United States took the United States is a global power. It has interests in every corner of the world. It has, 18 aircraft carriers. It has embassies all over the world. It projects power on a global scale. It has sort of full spectrum projection of power, unlike other countries. So the United States has priorities all throughout the world. But having a China-focused foreign policy also means you have to be interested in the Western Balkans, where China has prioritized the region as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. So, but getting back to the war in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has really, I would say, relaunched questions about the future of Euro-Atlantic integration, that is, integration of the region. And I'm really focused on Kosovo and Bosnia here because neither is in NATO, neither country is in the European Union. Kosovo, 48% of the world's countries in the world don't even recognize Kosovo. So it's kind of recalibrated foreign policy, where if you don't prioritize this, if you don't prioritize Europe, you're going to have more Ukraines. And where could additional Ukraines happen? That is, where could instability break out? Well, the Western Balkans. So the region remains only partially integrated. And my argument here is that it's best for your country to be in the European Union and NATO as it is for all the countries in the region. So it's a very vulnerable region under Russian influence. Russian influence in the region remains strong. Russia has significant economic investments in the region. It's focused on strategic energy, the strategic sector of energy. It takes advantage of patronage and political corruption in the region, these patronage networks. In recent years, Russia has also strengthened its military ties with Serbia, selling it more weapons, planes, and air defense systems. Excuse me. However, Serbia also has military exercises and drills that it conducts with NATO because it's a partnership for peace country. Also, the Russian Orthodox Church is front and center. This is an area I've been focusing on explicitly in my research, and I think that this is where you see a lot of opposition to Kosovo's independence, for example, and it's sort of an area that Russia is projecting its soft power. This has paved the way for Russia to extend its interests in Montenegro, Serbia, northern Kosovo, even to a certain extent here in North Macedonia. So for leaders like President Vučić in Serbia, or even Republika Srpska's Milorad Dodik, close ties with the Russian leadership, it's a matter of political survival for them. But it's the responsibility of both the United States and the EU to provide a strategic alternative to those models. And I think this is where the United States is struggling to catch up in the region. The United States can't just say to the region, we're better, they're worse. It has to offer a path. It has to offer opportunities. It's got to be substantive. It just can't be words. Like the recent sanctions that the Biden administration has imposed, sanctioning, I believe it was a number of different actors, the former president of Albania, the former president of Macedonia. And so I think that those are symbolic moves that the United States has made, but so far they seem just about signaling. And so U.S. foreign policy needs to kind of put teeth behind those and really prioritize certain things. There is now a condition in USAID funding that there's no links to any kind of corrupt actors, anyone involved in organized crime. Everything's got to be completely clean. So that is a priority for the United States. And I'd say since the invasion of since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen an uptick in extremist activity in the region. Are many of you, and I'm sure you are, a group that is, and I don't know whether to describe it as a paramilitary group or as just a gang. I mean, many of you are familiar with the Night Wolves, right? Do you know who they are? It's a gang, a motorcycle gang that travels around and terrorizes particular groups all throughout the region. We've seen an uptick in their activities. Just driving their motorcycles in particular regions and disrupting activities and just being very aggressive in how they go about carrying out a very intimidating sort of approach. Now, there are nationalist factions in the region, and we all know that's the case. And I think that the reason why the region needs to be focused or concerned with Russia is that Russia looks at the region as a buffer zone. I mean, I've seen the statements, I've seen Russia's strategic doctrine, and Russia is not going to invade a Western Balkans country, but it does see it as a sort of a front line in the great power competition as it views the region with the United States. So the region is seen as sort of, I would say, kind of contested for Russia. And I think the United States, having been focused in other areas throughout the world, has sort of taken its eye off, as we say, the ball. And what I want to do here is I want to focus to a great extent on, and I'm really interested in hearing your questions, because the questions are really important, and it'll keep me in a perspective where I'm going to learn a lot from you, as much as I hope you're learning from me. So here are the areas where I think the United States needs to pay particular attention to, especially in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. And that's number one, Serbia and Bosnia. In particular, Republika Srpska. This is where Russian influence is most pronounced. In Bosnia, I mean, there are fears that Ukraine could breed instability, and the inability to come to a uniform position within the country, and the dysfunction that we're seeing within that country. And I think a lot of this comes out of the Dayton agreements, which was a good peace agreement, I believe, but not a good governing system. And so I think that the Clinton administration had good intentions in negotiating Dayton, but I think Dayton was incredibly problematic, and I think we're seeing the problems associated with Dayton in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Excuse me. Russia's ambassador to Bosnia recently, in recent weeks, has fueled fears about Republika Srpska, that any rapprochement between Bosnia and NATO would be met with forceful Russian opposition. The quote is, "Ukraine's example shows what we can expect in Bosnia." So that is a very clear signal that Russia, part of its strategic doctrine in the region, is continued instability and efforts to undermine the rule of law. Germany has significantly warned of Russia's destabilizing strategies, especially in Bosnia. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has warned that Bosnia should be helped in becoming more resistant to outside influence. Germany wants to increase pressure on Dodik, who is now under U.S. sanction for corruption and threatening Bosnia's stability. In the last 2 months, American sanctions against Republika Srpska and Dodik have been backed up by the EU. The EU, and with American support, has suspended 100 million euros in infrastructure funding. The German parliament is also lobbying for an additional set of sanctions against Republika Srpska, but this has garnered very spotty support in Brussels. Now, besides Germany, I would say only Brussels, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the Czech Republic support German efforts to sort of tighten the EU's approach to Republika Srpska. And I think a lot of this is because the role of Hungary within the EU. It's vowed to veto any attempts at sanctioning Dodik, and that's likely a nod to Vučić in Belgrade, both of whom support Dodik. Now, the Serb representatives are not alone are not solely responsible for what's happening in Bosnia. I think also the Croat and the Bosniak representatives are growing more ethno-nationalist. All three groups in Bosnia are controlled by ethno-nationalist forces. The leader of the Bosnian Croat party, HDZ, Dragan Kovic, he's threatened in a letter sent to EU institutions, this is just in March alone, that attempts to reduce the status of Croats in Bosnia would reduce Bosnian Croats to a status of being a national minority that could lead to demanding territorial reorganization of the country. So, and that's largely a response to many statements made by Milorad Dodik. So Kovic's main aim is really to reform electoral law ahead of the parliamentary elections, which are scheduled for, I believe, in October, to bolster the Croats' position in the elections. Bakir, hopefully I'm getting his name right, Bakir Izetbegovic, the leading representative of the Bosniak ethnic group in Bosnia, has opposed attempts to overhaul the electoral system. So things seem to be getting more destabilizing in the country. In Kosovo, there's significant fear of, I mean, in Kosovo, there's always this fear, but it's become even more elevated in recent months, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I gave a talk at RIT Kosovo 2 months ago, and the audience was in fear. They were afraid. They thought that, that 1998, 1999 was going to happen again. They were very worried in the wake of the U.S.'s really bungled and mismanaged withdraw from Afghanistan, that the Americans wouldn't be there, or the West wouldn't be there, or KFOR wouldn't respond. And so it was a very fearful group of students and faculty who I met with. So that fear is there. So they are triggered by their the horrors of the 1990s, and so there is a frustration and a fear. And I think like other European nations, Kosovo, I mean, it's pledged to spend 2% of its GDP on defense. I think Kosovo also recently established a security fund where citizens can directly contribute to, because Kosovo wants in NATO. And so these are destabilizing signs. And if the Western Balkans are in fact the soft underbelly of Europe, then these are concerns that are just not going to go away. And earlier in the early days of the Russian invasion, Montenegro, I think, was very quick to join sanctions against Russia, but it's been slow in implementing most of them due to domestic political infighting that has taken place. Russia is the largest foreign direct investor in Montenegro. It has invested heavily in the real estate market and the tourism industry, and in sectors like metallurgy and mining. Making things worse is that Montenegro, half of its foreign debt is owed to one country and one country alone, and that is China. So I think that there's potential in the new minority-led government, which is relatively pro-Western, I think, or mostly pro-Western, however you want to look at it. I think the political party is the black-on-white bloc, could temper pro-Western voices in the country. However, America's attention is first and foremost actually on Serbia, where the new ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Serbia in Belgrade, Christopher Hill, has is really challenging the government in Belgrade to sort of make a choice between no longer balancing between East and West, but to take a stand. And that is going to be politically sensitive in Belgrade. So for a population that remembers being on the wrong end of, from their perspective, of Western sanctions, Alexander Vučić has really tried to portray himself as a sort of a middle ground, and really playing East off West. I just don't know how much longer he can continue to do that. Many people I speak to here in your country have told me that the U.S. trying to appeal to Serbia is a lost cause and to no longer do it, but the Biden administration is deeply engaging the country. So in addition to Ambassador Hill, Special Representative for the Western Balkans, Gabriel Escobar, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Karen Donfrey, they've made a full court press in Belgrade to promote normalization of relations with Kosovo. I do not know to what extent the results are going to be realistic, but if the Biden administration is just going to be one term, then the next 2 years are going to be pivotal. So the United States has discussed several opportunities in Serbia, and that is diversification of energy. But as Vučić has recently said, the Serbian side has met all of its obligations, while Pristina is the one being stubborn. So there's an approach there where I think President Vučić is saying we are the ones who want peace. Kosovo doesn't want peace, and that plays well to a domestic audience in Serbia. I just don't think it's not helpful because there are certain intentions behind that. Now, and this is where I want to really encourage you guys to ask me questions, and I think the time has come for the United States and the European Union to really step up, and the United Kingdom as well. The United States, the Biden administration, is working to align its strategy with the European Union and to really redouble efforts, I think, at combating destabilization. But I think that's only half the story. The United States and its allies, Brussels and London, cannot just say we have to combat destabilization. It has to offer a positive path forward. It actually has to make a long-term investment in the region. And I think the Biden administration is trying to do that. And it's doing it through a familiar geopolitical lens, right? So two very different futures await the region, at least this is from my perspective. Either growing instability led by Russia, or growing indebtedness to China, or lasting integration within the EU and NATO. And I think after years of stalemate, the brutal war in Ukraine is really forcing key actors in the region to choose a path, to make a decision. To make a decision to determine whether or not it's better to be in NATO or to better be in NATO or the EU, in the EU, rather than be standing outside. The war in Ukraine is not going to end soon. It's not going to be quick. It's going to be a long war, I think. And after Russia's, I think the intention of the war was to take Kyiv within 3 days, overthrow Zelensky, and then assume control over the entire country. That has not happened. The United States is investing heavily in military equipment and to help rebuild the country. So this is going to be a long, long struggle and conflict. Food prices and gas prices are going to continue to be, excuse me, are going to continue to rise. This is not going to go away anytime soon. I believe Ukraine has actually already defeated Russia, preventing it from decapitating the regime, taking the capital, and assuming control over the country. So Ukraine is now fighting to prevent itself from being landlocked, I think is what the war has now become. However, I would not be surprised, and I think that you really need to take this into serious consideration. The war has a dangerous chance of spilling over, of expanding, of spreading. If Russia is going to make Ukraine transform it into a landlocked country, it needs to take Odessa, which means it needs to move into Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, which the United States does not recognize as being separate and independent. And if that war expands into that territory, then there's going to be a real debate as to whether or not NATO is going to get involved. Because with a destabilized Moldova, there's a destabilized Romania, which is in NATO. And so there are strong concerns that this war is going to widen. It just takes one miscalculation for it to expand or become even more dangerous. So the coming months are going to offer opportunities to discuss the future of this region, the Western Balkans. Excuse me. I think this has to be led to a great extent from the EU, from France, the newly re-elected president, Emmanuel Macron, he's chair of the European Union, has to really make a forceful approach to the region to help settle the Bulgaria, Macedonia tension. And I'm going to leave it there. At a political level, I think it's imperative that NATO and the EU answer the call to speed up integration on the whole. For the EU, this has to be led by France, but it also has to be supported vehemently and publicly by the Biden administration and the Johnson government in London. But Paris and, to a great extent, Berlin have been hesitant about doing this. And so we've seen signs of, as soon as possible, has been the approach from Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President Emmanuel Macron for giving the region a quote-unquote clear perspective of accession to the European Union, and that means you. So a revived accession process would foster much-needed rule of law reforms that still have to be made. As a country that's making progress towards the European Union, that means you're going to have to align the role of media in this country, the role of judicial independence in this country. And I think those incentives are good things. Excuse me. I took a COVID test yesterday and I'm negative. So, my allergies. So, oh, we do? Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Yes. My allergies are really bad here. I would say that the recent action by the UN's High Representative in Republika Srpska was a welcome indication, I think, that Dodik, his violation of the country's constitution, and the responses from Bosnian Croat and Bosniak groups are unacceptable. So too are American actions to sanction the individuals from the region deemed to, from an American perspective, to pose a threat to regional stability. Those are good moves, they're symbolic moves, but they're signals that the Western Balkans are, again, an American priority. I would say in the economic domain, the most important thing here is to bolster assistance to mitigate the spillover effects from Ukraine into the region. Higher energy prices, food insecurity, these factors have to be addressed. And I don't just mean a response to them, I mean to develop a set of programs that make sure that in the future, the region is not subject to the kind of instability that it's experiencing now. On the energy front, the US and the EU have agreed to allow Western Balkans countries to take part in, well, the US has supported, but the EU has allowed, to take part in joint gas purchases to contain energy costs. Similar action should be taken over food prices, especially the cost of bread. Over the long run, the EU has to accelerate implementation of its 30 billion euro investment plan it announced last year until 2027. And those investments have to take place in green energy, food and energy diversification, and infrastructure, not just as a way to check and balance China's Belt and Road initiatives, but to build a lasting future in the country that's integrated with the EU and also one that's not indebted to China. So I would say in closing, before I take questions, for many people in the region, the brutal images coming out of Ukraine, especially Bucha, for the past several weeks, refugees crowding trains, missile strikes at bus stations and train stations, buildings bombed, bodies lying in the street, have evoked a dangerous and concerning specter of the past in this region. And I think that as the UK, the EU, and the United States contemplate the future for the region, the most pressing concern is demanding attention by quickening the pace of Euro-Atlantic integration. And I think that that is the best hope for the region, is greater integration with NATO and the EU. And I'll leave it at there and take your questions. Excuse me. So if anyone has any questions.
Дали некој има прашање? Да, повелете. Ви благодарам, доктор Криснео, дайте.
Okay.
Hello.
Ке ве молам само да се представите, да кажете од кој факултет доаѓате.
My name is Katerina, and I have a question. Does Europe have mechanisms to prevent radicalization in the Balkans? Is the economic crisis opening the door to right-wing policies?
To right-wing policies. I think that is, I've done a lot of research on political extremism in the region, and one of the areas that I'm tracking was, we've seen the number of people who've traveled and fought with ISIS, right, from the region, but the numbers of people who are traveling to fight with Russia and Ukraine are far higher. They're greater, and I think a lot of that comes out of extremist elements in the region. The numbers are greater, they're higher, and I think that the role of extremist groups in the country have only amplified and gotten greater and louder on all sides. But I think in particular, a lot of our research that we're showing has extremism coming out of proxies and intermediaries through the Orthodox Church. And I think that as those voices get louder, there's potential for instability in the country. And I think that there are some things that the governments in the region can do, and that is to combat, number one, disinformation, lies that are being spread, and also to combat corruption. Also, keeping your young people here, preventing them from leaving. And I think that one of the conversations I have on a daily basis with my students is that they get apathetic and disaffected by corruption, patronage, and also extremist rhetoric that's largely ethnic-based. And if there are more and more young people who are going to be leaving the country, then the country's future is really harmed. So I think that right-wing voices are loud. I don't know to what extent they're not representative of people in the region. They're representative of small extremist groups, but the voices are getting louder. And I think in order to combat those voices, there has to be a principled focus on combating disinformation, which is the tool of extremists. And there are a number of different ways that one can go about doing that. Promoting media and information literacy skills among young people early in their educations, but to also pump as much and crank out as much legitimate information as possible. To have a free and independent media in this country, I think, is absolutely essential. And what I mean by a free and independent media, I'm not just talking about free and independent from the government. I'm talking about free and independent from the political parties. And so I think that is essential. But I do think extremism is on the rise. But I think that extremism can be combated with a concerted effort over combating false narratives, which I think drown out legitimate narratives.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Некој друг колега, повелете?
Hello, I'm Jane. Since you mentioned that through the years, the past US administrations had been focusing on other regions, so do you think now, right now, that the game that Russia has been playing here, that strategic game, is so Russia is a few steps ahead of the United States here right now in this region, or you think there's still time to make some moves and get stabilized?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think when President Obama in 2011, I don't know if you recall this or familiar with this, he got on television, and he was advised by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to say this. He had talked about a pivot or a rebalance to Asia. And what that meant was the U.S., well, this is how it was taken in Europe. The United States is going to spend less time focusing on Europe and more time focusing on Asia. And a lot of that was market-driven, security-driven, and it's been a 10-year process for the United States to engage in that pivot. And I think that provided enough opportunity for Russia to exercise its influence. And one area I study is hybrid war. Hybrid war is cheap, low-cost ways of interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries without launching a military attack, right? That's disinformation, disinformatia, that is cyber attacks, which you're familiar with in this country. Also, I would say narrative or information operations. Russia focuses on a narrative of being a maligned victim that's aggrieved by the West. Russia likes to talk about NATO expansion. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. NATO does not expand. Countries freely choose to join NATO. That's how it works in a rules-based international order. The United States and the UK don't say, okay, we're going to take you and put you in NATO. That's not how it works. The whole idea of NATO expansion is part of an aggrieved narrative that Russia uses against the West, that they are the victims. NATO is a defensive alliance that countries freely choose based on their own choice. And so I think the United States is playing catch-up in this area. It has taken its eye off the ball. It has spent far too much time focusing on other areas of the world, and look what happens. Russia was able to, I wouldn't say fill a vacuum or a void, but it was able to exercise enough influence to become enough of a disruptor to provide what I believe is a series of negative themes in the region. I think the United States is getting a little bit better at this. The United States is very frustrated. Has had a long series of frustrations with understanding the complexities of hybrid war. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, that was a big wake-up call in the United States. And there was really not that much of a response other than small sanctions. And the whole notion that you could redraw a country's borders without using violent military force. I mean, obviously Russia deployed its little green men, but it was a combination of cyber, disinformation. When Russia intervened in the American election in 2016 to engineer the rise of Donald Trump, which benefited the Kremlin to a great extent, that was another wake-up call. So the United States is beginning the process of reconceptualizing the meaning of security away from a conventional military approach to one of blending and blurring of disinformation, cyber, and military, and diplomacy. So I think that there's, the United States is a little behind right now. It was way behind before, but it's catching up. I think the way the United States released intelligence about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I don't know if you saw this, but on television, President Biden, I think this was one of his more effective moves, was to announce how the United States he came out and said, Russia's going to invade Ukraine, and here's the intelligence. I think that is the proper way of going about doing it. I think that's where Obama fell short. Trump didn't help at all, and was counterproductive to a great extent. And where the Biden administration has finally learned, excuse me, to understand how its rivals behave. And it's in this gray zone. So hybrid conflict happens in this kind of murky middle ground of where you don't know what is legal or what is illegal, what is force and what is not force. What exactly triggers Article 5 of NATO? Like, when do you respond? Is a cyber attack a violation of collective security? So I think the United States is getting better, but it's definitely not there yet. Thank you. I apologize for the long response. I am an academic. Are there any other questions? Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Eva Ilioska, and I'm from the Faculty of Detectives and Security. I wanted to ask if you think that the European Union has taken the issue of the security of the Balkans seriously.
The question was, let me get this right, has the European Union taken security seriously in the region?
Yes.
It is now. It hadn't in the past. And I think that what I said about the situation in Bosnia deteriorating and the lack of progress between Kosovo and Serbia, I mean, those are two neighboring countries. They share a border with one another. They have to eventually get to the point where they normalize. I think the EU has been counterproductive in a number of different areas. And I think a lot of it is because of France and the Netherlands putting a pause on EU expansion, or encouraging and providing a path forward for countries in the region to accede to the European Union. There was a poll that just came out where a plurality of Serbs don't view acceding to the EU as a priority. And I think that has caused fatigue in the region. I think it has left countries, especially you, in the waiting room, and has not provided a path forward. Remember what the EU is. It is a supranational institution, but it is not the primary security provider in Europe. That role is for NATO. And I think the EU has not given you a priority in providing a path forward. It has used technical requirements to keep you in the waiting room. And I think that has an effect of rising fatigue, rising apathy. It has led to even greater forms of political corruption and extremism. And the longer you wait in the waiting room, the more unlikely, the less of a value joining the EU becomes. And I think that's a lesson the EU is learning now. But remember what the EU is. It's still a collection of separate and individual nation states who fight and, what I like to call in the United States, bicker and conflict with one another. They all have their own agendas, right? So I think that to a great extent, the EU has been counterproductive in this area. But don't give up hope on the EU. Yet it's better to be in the EU than not be in the EU.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Greetings to you, sir. My name is Mario from the Faculty of Law. My question to you is, how will this situation in Ukraine be reflected in terms of security, specifically in relations to the Western Balkans? What in case of a possible Russian victory? Thank you in advance.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's, excuse me, that's the point. Yeah, I mean, that's the point of my talk, right, is to say that I think it's going to accelerate security in the region, number one. And I think it shows what could happen if you are not in NATO and you're not in the EU. I mean, what are Finland and Sweden doing right now? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to do? I'm asking everyone in this room. What are they trying to join? NATO. Why do you think Russia has not invaded the Baltics? They're in NATO. Sweden and Finland are abandoning years of non-alignment as a way of having an agreement with Russia to not join NATO. They're both in the European Union, but why do they want NATO? They're scared. They're afraid. So I think that to a great extent, the invasion of Ukraine has been counterproductive to what Vladimir Putin wants. That is to exert Russian hegemony in Eastern Europe and in Southeastern Europe. So when I say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been counterproductive, this is Putin's nightmare, to have Finland, which shares a 1,000-kilometer border with Russia, in NATO. So it's going in the opposite direction. Why? Because countries are afraid, they're concerned. They don't just want the American or British security umbrella, they want the security of Article 5 in NATO. That if Russia does invade, or does launch a hybrid attack, that the rest of the alliance is going to be there. So I go to that example as a complete 180. Putin got his worst nightmare, and that is more countries want to join NATO than not want to join NATO. Now, there are certain, now I don't know if Ukraine, I think Ukraine is probably going to be too much of a liability to join NATO. I mean, there are certain facets of NATO membership, and that is, number one, you have to have secure borders. So I think part of Russia's role in Ukraine is to make it so dysfunctional that NATO would never accept their choice to join the alliance. But I think to a great extent, it's incentivized countries to want to join NATO. And it's better that you are in NATO than not be in NATO. North Macedonia joined NATO in March, April of 2020, right? There would be a significant concern if you were not in NATO. You'd be wanting to get in. And this is the reason why there's so much fear and concern in places like Kosovo and Bosnia. So thank you for that's a really good question. So I think the theme and kind of closing here is that Russia's gotten exactly the opposite of what it intended.
Прашања? Имате други прашања? Доколку немате, дозволете ми да се заблагодарам на доктор Крис Долан за неговото излагање, за неговото предавање. Thank you very much, Dr. Chris, for providing this important educational experience for our students. And we hope to have in the future, certainly again, you here as a lecturer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moment.
Buenos dias. I speak Spanish, so it doesn't help here, though.
I speak Russian also. That's
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah, спасибо очень большое. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
До
me
свидания.
here.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciation for you being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is great. Really good question. Yeah.
Actually, I don't share your optimism. Let's say that it's not that bad.
Dobro.